Hello. Welcome to Makash 50. What I missed? Next year, Makash 50. Welcome to Makash 10. Thank you. My name is Dora Komiak, class of 1991, the great class of 1991, off year. Yay! Thank you. Thank you. I have notes, but I'm stunned because what I wanted to say was I remember Makash 10 being full here to listen to the lectures of the late Stephen Cohen for the very popular Soviet politics class.
It was right in here. There's my seat right over there.
And the more popular Soviet joke lecture, but I never remember seeing it this full. What I do remember, having taken that class, is that Ukraine was not mentioned very much in the Soviet politics class. And so it's particularly thrilling for me to see Makash 10 looking the way it does right now. I'm the CEO of an organization called Razum. Razum means together in Ukrainian. We've been working in Ukraine for 10 years. Over the past 2 years, we've raised and deployed over $116 million of aid. Thank you. That was possible because over 220,000 people donated to support our aid and advocacy work. So like this room, many times over. So thank you to everyone in the room who has already contributed. So yes, I am now, class of 91, working in the nation's service and in the service of humanity through Razum. So it's particularly exciting for me to be here today in this room, this particular room, to spend the next hour and change talking about Ukraine. So before I introduce our discussants, I want to do a little show of hands. Who has ever been to Ukraine or to Soviet Ukraine? Hold on. Okay. Thank you. Who has been to Ukraine since Russia's full-scale invasion on February 24th, 2022? Thank you. New show of hands, keep it up, that's great. Audience participation, thank you very much. So I think you understand now from my own personal story, student of Stephen Cohen's, not much about Ukraine, wrote my thesis about Ukraine, nevertheless, actually. You can pick it up in Mud Library. It is particularly a privilege for me to introduce the three people on stage here today. First, from the great class of 1980, Ambassador Marie Yovanovitch. Talk about in the nation's service, who has represented us in the Foreign Service and has since gone on to become a best-selling author. Highly recommend her book. Pick it up, get it signed. Sitting next to her is General Mark Milley, also from the great class of 1980. Now on the faculty of this great institution, and if we convince him, he just might have a book in him too, I hear.
Several.
And leading the conversation today from the terrific class of 2013, can't believe it, Lauren Blakeney, who is currently in the Foreign Service and representing all of us here in Romania. So the way we're gonna run this, here's what happens next. Lauren's gonna lead a conversation and leave some time for Q&A. And then my colleague Lydia will come up and make a few announcements. So listen carefully, ask and get ready with your questions. Thank you.
That's a nice job.
Good afternoon, everyone. It's great to be back at Reunions. First, a huge thanks to Ambassador Yovanovitch and General Milley for being here today to share their experience in the government and their thoughts on the future of Ukraine. I think it's clear that we are all very interested to hear what they have to say. We're going to leave a lot of time for questions because we can tell from this crowd, we're sure you have many. But let's set the stage. The topic of our conversation today of why Ukraine matters. The United States recently Congress passed $61 billion of appropriations for Ukraine that came after months of intense debate. So this question of why Ukraine matters, why we should be spending billions of US dollars on supporting Ukraine is clearly at the heart of our national conversation now. Since the Congressional Appropriations Package passed, we've now had, I think, 6 different packages of specific aid to Ukraine from the United States. Allies and partners around the world are contributing billions as well. And we're seeing these weapons and other assistance go immediately to the front lines. But as we're thinking about the critics of our participation in Ukraine, questions on sustainability of this level of support, questions about Ukraine's ability to win the war, questions of the broader geopolitical ramifications of US and other Western support. I'll turn it over first to each of you to say, why should we be spending US money supporting Ukraine? What's in it for us? Why does Ukraine matter? Ambassador Yovanovitch, I'll turn to you first.
All right. So thank you for that very easy question, because I know it's, it's a question that's out there, but Ukraine does matter. And so, as somebody who spent 6 years of their life in Ukraine, you would expect me to say that. But there are a couple of really important reasons why this is not just about Ukraine's survival and Ukraine's security, it's about our own. So Russia has made very clear that if they are successful in Ukraine with this war of aggression, that they are going to keep on going. Putin has said this, he has written this, and I think in his actions since he took power in the year 2000, you can see that he has made good on his promises. And so, when you look at where Ukraine is, the largest country in Europe, with all sorts of possibilities, Russia wants to swallow Ukraine if it can, and then it really wants to keep on going. And right now, Russia is testing us, not only in Ukraine, but also, for example, in the Baltics. Just 2 nights ago, on the border between Estonia and Russia, they took away the marker buoys in the river that demarcates that boundary line, saying they're going to make some changes. Some changes are necessary. Well, we've seen how Russia wants to make change. And it is not a change, I think, that any of us would want to live in, because if Russia is the country that is setting the rule, if we're living in a Putin-G kind of a world, we are going to be less prosperous, less secure, and frankly, less free. And so I think this very much does affect us. We've been living in kind of the post-World War II era, after the international rules-based system was set up, that has really worked out for most of the world, including actually even the Soviet Union / Russia. And I think if Putin is successful in Ukraine, it will, that post-war order will crumble. And I'm not saying that we don't need to make changes and make it more inclusive and make other reforms, but I think that before we throw the baby out with the bathwater, we need to take a very careful look. We need to stand by our partners, we need to stand by our allies and our interests and our values. And Lauren just mentioned the supplemental. With that long delay in the supplemental that all of you probably know too much about, we were sending signals to the world. We were sending signals to our allies that maybe they couldn't count on us, and we were sending signals to our adversaries that we weren't going to stick with it. And that creates a situation not only in Ukraine, where the Ukrainians started to wonder whether we were going to stick with them, but it also creates concerns in Taiwan, China. Other adversaries are looking at what we do. Do we have the stick-to-itiveness? Are we going to stand up for what's right? Are we going to stand up for, what the smart thing is to do in terms of our own national security? So Mark, I'm sure you have other thoughts.
Yeah, so I would refer people actually to President Biden's Warsaw speech to answer the question, what's it all about? When the Russians invaded, shortly thereafter, we had a session with the president, actually on the same day. And one of the things we as generals are always looking for out of our political leadership, we want to know the purpose. You got to answer the question, why? What's it all about, right? Why? What are we doing? And why are we doing what we're about to do? And what's the end state? So we're always looking for that. And then we're always looking for constraints and restraints, the must-dos and the can't-dos. And if you give us that guidance, if you tell us the purpose, the end state, what you can do and what you can't do, then we, the military, will devise plans to help you achieve those strategic objectives. And without prompting from me or anyone else, our current president, based basically on 40 or 50 years of being a senator, I suppose, and lots of experience and growing up in the wake of World War II and so on, he clearly and succinctly and very quickly said the purpose of this is the rules-based international order, the global order that the ambassador just referred to. And the end state is a free, independent Ukraine with its sovereignty intact. And the must-do, you must keep NATO together, and you must keep Congress together, at which point I said, that would be your job, Mr. President, not mine. And then you must not have a kinetic armed conflict with Russia. So let me roll the clock back a little bit. So next week, my wife, who's sitting over here, by the way, married 39 years, and we are the proud grandparents of 4. We just had our 4th grandchild 4 weeks ago. So what this is all about, it's about them. It's about those 4 grandkids, right? It's about the future, the global order. For Ukraine, this is about survival. It's an existential threat. For Russia, which we could explain in question and answer as to what their logic is, which I don't agree with, but you can explain their logic. But for us, the United States, for Europe, for the rest of the world, it's about this so-called rules-based international order, which is maligned and denigrated by a lot of people using words like globalist and globaloni and all that kind of stuff, right? And that we Americans, we should be worried way more about the southwest border than we should be worried about the Ukrainian border. We Americans should be worried more about what's going on at home than we should be abroad. Yeah, okay, that sort of makes sense, except roll that clock back. Next week, my wife and I are traveling to France to attend the 80th anniversary of the Normandy invasion. We're 80 years past the end of World War II. And on that day, that month, June 1944, on 15 June 1944, my dad was hitting the beach at Saipan with the 4th Marine Division. He was the oldest of 10 from Somerville, Massachusetts, no college, no Princeton, no Harvard, laborer family. And his one younger brother, one below him, he was hitting the beach at Omaha Beach. So one's at Omaha, one's at Saipan, while my grandmother's in Somerville taking care of the other 8. My father and my uncle, and my mother was in the Navy taking care of the wounded, coming back to the Central Pacific. They fought for something. They fought for a better peace. They fought to prevent great power war. Between 1914, August, the beginning of World War I, and 1945, the end of World War II, 150 million people got slaughtered in the conduct of great power war. Everyone in this room is a product of that. Some of you may have been born during the war. Most of you had parents or grandparents. I had an uncle that was wounded at the Meuse-Argonne in World War I, another one was wounded at Gallipoli in World War I. Those wars were unbelievable. 26,000 Americans, not including French, not including Germans, not including Brits, 26,000 Americans were killed from Normandy to Paris in 8 weeks. At Iwo Jima, 7,000 Marines died and 34,000 were wounded in 19 days. Great power war is nothing to mess with. So what Vladimir Putin did is he took the end of World War II and he did a frontal assault on the very principles and values for which we fought. If you look at the United Nations, if you look at the purpose for why we fought the war, it was to prevent aggressive war by great powers using their military to attack and assault smaller countries not in defense of themselves. Ukraine was never going to attack Russia, ever going to attack Russia. Now, Russia may have thought that. They might have thought the NATO boundary. There's a lot of ways to explain it. But the fact is, Ukraine was never going to attack Russia. Vladimir Putin launched a classical war of aggression, an imperial war to seize Ukraine in violation of the very first principle of the United Nations, to prevent aggressive war. We fought in the Korean War when the North Koreans came across the border. Harry Truman, president, he knew instantly what was at stake, and it was the principles of World War II. When Saddam Hussein went into Kuwait, Bush, the elder, he knew exactly what to do and deployed the 82nd Airborne Division immediately, because Saddam Hussein was doing a frontal assault on the principles of World War II, which was his formative life's experience. When Putin went across that border a couple of years ago, when he crossed that border on 7 axes of advance with 250,000 troops to assault and seize the country of Ukraine, that was a gross frontal assault on the global rules-based order that was put in place, the end of World War II. Now, there were 2 previous orders, one from 1648 to the 1750s in Europe, Continental Order, and that's the Treaty of Westphalia. Everyone's familiar with it, right? And it breaks down into what we today call the French and Indian War in the United States, the 7 Years' War in Europe. And then all of a sudden, Europe goes into 60 years, from 1750 to 1815, 65 years of unrestrained warfare. And then the people said, well, we better figure this out. And they established the Concert of Europe. And that lasts from 1815 to 1914, 100 years. So the 2 previous orders in Europe lasted a century. We are in the 80th year of this order that was put in place in 1945. And if we do not stand up and make sure that Putin loses, if we do not ensure that that order is sustained and maintained, then God help us all. It will be a tragedy. And those aren't my words necessarily, by the way. That is your president's words. So that's what this war is about. That's why we're supporting them. Maybe we need to do a better job explaining it, but that's what it's about. And we're not going to stop until Ukraine is free, independent, with the territory intact.
General Milley, one component of this post-World War II international order that you touched on, and that is another big part of this, is NATO. Putin did not expect when he fully invaded Ukraine in 2022 that he would set in motion the process that led to NATO being more unified than it has been in decades, and the addition of 2 new member states. The death of NATO had been proclaimed prior to this. We had all gotten used to a world with our NATO protections, with our Article 5 protections. Ambassador Yovanovitch, you were kind enough to visit us in Romania just a few weeks ago. And in Romania, they're celebrating 20 years in NATO, which means there's a new generation coming up who has never known life outside of this defensive alliance. And so I think my question, I'll start with Ambassador Yovanovitch, how do we explain to those new populations too, how to fight against this complacency when President Macron in 2019 called NATO brain dead and sort of sent ripples around the world? I think there's been a wake-up call, part of that led by the Eastern flank countries too. How do we prevent that from sliding back off the radar as we look forward?
So I think it's really important that younger generations learn about the past as we think about the future. And the past, we can't be constrained by the past, but it needs to inform the decisions we're making and the steps that we're going to take. And so NATO is the most successful defense pact, and it's a defense pact in the history of the world. You know, again, it has, you know, kept the peace since 1945, more or less in Europe, with the exception of some regional wars, but more or less. I mean, the great wars that General Milley was talking about, we haven't seen that. And again, hopefully we're not going to see it because we are going to stand strong with Ukraine and keep that, you know, help Ukraine fight off Russia and frankly defeat Russia, because that's what needs to happen. So I think that, you know, part of it is, you know, educating people, letting them know about the past, letting them know about the future, letting them know about the risks. I also think that, you know, we spend a lot of time thinking about the kinetic war, what's happening in Kharkiv, what's happening all along the front lines, because it's a long one, and, you know, which territory has been taken back and forth. But there's also another war. It's a psychological war, and it has to do with the way Russia is playing with our minds, basically, with disinformation. And they are very adept at it. They did it during the Soviet era. They are continuing to do it now as an independent Russia. And, you know, sometimes the target is people in Ukraine. Sometimes it is people in Europe. Often it is us. And when you have Republicans in the leadership talking about how Russian talking points that have been spread through this disinformation are being used to attack Ukraine and to argue against the supplemental. I mean, that is a very, very dangerous place to be. And when we think about our elections coming up, our presidential elections coming up this fall, the Russians aren't just, you know, making it clear that they are hoping for a particular candidate to win. They are putting their finger on the weights, and they are trying to mold our thinking about what is happening, what has happened, and what will happen. So I think part of it is we all need to, and this is true for younger generations as well, we all need to be, you know, critical of the things we're reading, the information we're getting. If it doesn't make sense to you, it probably doesn't make sense. And figuring out how to do things next. But here's the thing that I would say. So we started this conversation, and or not the conversation, this question with NATO. NATO, you know, we've all heard a lot about how the US does so much for NATO and countries are taking advantage of us and so on and so forth. I think that, you know, many people, I don't know if the general would agree with me, but many people would consider that our system of partnerships and alliances is right up there with our strong economy, our strong military, and our great values in terms of keeping the US where it is, working for, you know, strong and true, and working for the American people. And NATO, when NATO, you all know about Article 5, an attack on one is an attack on all. There's only been one time in the history, the 80-year history of NATO, that Article 5 was invoked, and that was after 9/11 when the US was attacked. So when I look at the NATO alliance and other alliances around the world, I really have to think that we get at least as much out of it as other countries do as well. And we need to bear that in mind, because whether it's the military, whether it is the State Department where I used to work, whether it is other kinds of cooperation we have all over the world, we need to keep that going so that we continue to have commerce, we continue to keep our country strong and healthy. Excuse me.
So it's exactly right. Our system of alliances, friends and allies around the world is one of the 2 or 3 or 4 asymmetric strengths that the United States has vis-a-vis other great powers. The other 2 great powers, obviously China and Russia. China has some friends, not a whole lot, and it's pretty much transactional. It's done with intimidation and money and a few other things, right? But but they don't have anything close to us. And Russia, I mean, seriously, you know, North Korea, Iran, you know, Belarus, okay, if that's your buddies. So, I mean, they don't have a lot of friends. We have a very, very robust set of friends and allies around the world. And that is a huge asymmetric advantage over any other power in the world. We have, roughly speaking, on a given day, probably about 250,000. We have 2.1 million in the U.S. military, active guard reserve. About 240,000 are deployed overseas at a moment in time, and they're in about 140 countries. And that gives you a sense of our overseas presence. Now, that comes under a lot of criticism, too. There are many people out there who would argue, especially in academia and think tanks, but elsewhere, that's imperial overstretch, America's an empire. I don't agree with that, by the way. I think the opposite. I think we're not an empire, and I don't think we're in overstretch. I happen to think that those troops are out there as a force for good in general, and that's a force of stability to maintain that rules-based order that we wrote. We, the United States, wrote that set of rules in 1944-45 at a hotel up in New Hampshire for 6 weeks on Smith Corona typewriters. 400 diplomats literally got together for 6 weeks. 400 diplomats, about a dozen or so Americans, and the rest of them from all other countries that were the Allied victors in World War II. And they banged away, and they debated, and they argued, and they, at the end of the day, the United States had the preponderance of power. We had 18 million people under uniform. We had 300 aircraft carriers. We had the least damage in the war. We had 60% of the world's gross domestic product. We had the least damage. I mean, Russia suffered 25 million killed. Japan was laid waste. Germany was laid waste. Britain was flat on its back. France was, destroyed, and so on and so forth. So we had the power at the time. We wrote the rules, we Americans, and we said, okay, we're not doing 1914, 1945 again. And oh, by the way, we just dropped 2 nuclear weapons. So it's a nuclear age, and here's the rules. So those forces are out there. Fundamental to maintaining peace on the European continent has been NATO. And anything that undermines NATO, which would be a really bad thing to do from our perspective, that's exactly what Putin wants to do. 2 of Putin's strategic objectives are to destroy NATO and separate the United States from Europe. If he can do that, then that's a major strategic win for aggression, for unvarnished 1930s-style military aggression. And that's exactly what he wants to do. So NATO is key, and our system of alliances and partners around the world are key.
And I would just add that even the French have refound a new love for NATO.
Right.
Ambassador Yovanovitch, you mentioned just now that we spend a lot of time talking about the kinetic war, about the renewed assaults on Kharkiv. So I'd like to ask about the kinetic war and the renewed assaults on Kharkiv. If we could turn it over to you, General Milley, to say, the past 12, 18 months have been rough going. It's been marked by mounting casualties. We've seen incremental changes on the front lines. A lot of people want to know, what is the trajectory for this war? Where do we see this going in 6 to 12 months' time, and how do we best support Ukraine to get to that desired outcome?
Well, war is the conduct of war, combat operations, a very dynamic, very violent interaction between 2 competing wills, like Clausewitz says, and it's an act of politics. So it's an act of politics by violence. It's your imposition of your political will over your opponent by the use of organized violence. And there is no absolutes in terms of predictions. It's very dynamic. It can go in a lot of different directions. There's a lot of intervening variables, etc. I would argue that at the beginning, the very beginning of this thing, and I understand first that there was a previous invasion in 2014, and the lack of proper response to that invasion emboldened Putin and in many ways encouraged the 2022 invasion. So we picked up early the indicators, September, October timeframe, the early indicators that Russia was massing forces, and it was going to be something much different than their annual exercise. And then our intelligence is quite good, and we became increasingly aware. Understand, though, that Ukraine is not an Article 5 country. Therefore, no U.S. troops running to the rescue, sort of thing. Weapons, equipment, monetary support, etc., but not U.S. troops. So the Russians come across. There were several alternative outcomes. The Russian intent at the time was to overrun Kyiv, kill or capture Zelensky and his government, get to the Dnipro River about halfway through Ukraine, pause long enough to do the May Day parade and say victory and all that, you know, make Russia great again, all that stuff. And then that's what he said. And then pause and then continue from the Dnipro out to the Carpathian Mountains, stop at the Carpathian Mountains. And the Carpathian Mountains were the holdout in World War II of the anti-Soviet resistance sort of thing. So that was the original plan. So they come in, 7 active advance, a couple 100,000 troops, a mech armor, task forces, airborne units, aircraft, missiles, all that kind of stuff, right? And the Ukrainians fought a tremendous defensive battle. They did it with a lot of help from the United States, with intelligence. We acted in many ways as the ultra secret for the Ukrainians. But more than that, the Ukrainian people. So the Russians weren't fighting the Ukrainian army. The Russians were fighting the Ukrainian people. So every person in every village was with cell phones or runners or whatever means of communication they had. They were telling the Ukrainian military, hey, the Russians are coming down this street or coming over this hill or that hill. So the Russians engaged the entire Ukrainian people, and not just their military. And they were defeated by their military and the Ukrainian people. And when I use the word defeat, what I mean is their objectives were not met. The Russian objectives were defeated. They weren't met. And that became clear towards the end of April, into March, into April. And Putin recognized that. So Putin then changes direction. He pulls the forces out of northeast Ukraine and brings them around, and then he changes his strategic objectives, which were his adjusted objectives, which were to seize all of the Donbass region and to connect the land bridge into Crimea. So he launches a second wave of an offensive that goes basically April, May, June, and it peters out and culminates in the July timeframe, at which point the Ukrainians launched 2 counterattacks, one up in Kharkiv and one down in Kherson. And both of those counterattacks were quite successful, and Ukraine essentially regained significant portions of their captured territory, right? And that's kind of where the line stabilized going into the winter of 22, 23. And you had, I called it at the time, I said publicly, and I got beat about the head and shoulders for saying it, that it was a stalemate, military stalemate, that the Russians no longer had the military capability to achieve their strategic political objectives militarily, and the Ukrainians didn't have this military capability to eject all the Russians. And there were about 200,000 or 300,000 Russians in occupied Ukraine at the time. Now, at that point, and up until today, the Russians have suffered somewhere in the vicinity of 400,000 to 450,000 killed and wounded, almost 500,000 Russian troops. They've lost probably 50% of their infantry fighting vehicles and their tanks. They've lost a significant amount of aircraft. They fired a lot of munitions and missiles and so on and so forth. So the Russian army, their ground forces, have really had a tough go. And he has had to mobilize twice to replace his losses, Putin. Now, the Ukrainians have also lost significantly. They've lost 20% of their territory. About a third of their arable land has been destroyed. Their economy is laid waste. They too have lost 200,000+ troops, about 50, 60, maybe 70,000 innocent Ukrainian civilians have been killed. So this is a humanitarian catastrophe, and militarily, even today, right now, even though the Russians are launching an offensive, it is essentially at a military stalemate. So there's going to be tactical wins back and forth on the battlefield, but they're going to be small. The Russian offensive that started a couple of weeks ago, they've managed to advance, I think it's 5 or 6 miles in. They're maybe 20, 25 miles outside of Kharkiv. There's a lot of fighting going on. But the probability of Russia overrunning Ukraine is probably not going to happen. But similarly, the probability of Ukraine militarily ejecting 200,000, 300,000 Russians out of Russian-occupied Ukraine, that's probably not going to happen either. So militarily, you are at a military stalemate, even with our aid. So if we stop aid, then everything will shift to the Russians, and you'll have a military victory for the Russians. If you stop aid, which is what was threatened here not too long ago. So if aid continues, military aid, money, weapons, etc., then the fighting will continue. The Russians won't win, but it'll be very, very difficult. And people talk about magic weapons, F-16s, ATACMs. There are no magic weapons in war, unless you want to talk nuclear weapons, and we're not going to go there for that. So conventional weapons, there's no magic wonder weapon that's going to win this thing. The outcomes in wars are the synergistic effect of all the things on the battlefield at the same time in place and so on. The probability of a military victory, a clean military victory, unconditional surrender, Appomattox, World War II, Tokyo Bay, that's probably not in the cards. Could it happen? Sure, anything can happen, but probability is not there. So what has to happen? Well, I think you'll see sort of in the news, reading between the lines, you'll see that there are some initiatives happening in the world of diplomacy. At the end of the day, this is going to have to be solved diplomatically with some sort of negotiation that is satisfactory to the security needs of Ukraine and somehow answer the mail for the Russians. That's the only logical, rational, moral way. Otherwise, this just ends up in continuous killing forever and ever and ever. So that's what I think will end up happening, assuming people are rational. They'll recognize that cost is exceeding benefit, and they'll go to a negotiating table. But we're not there yet, and we're a ways away from that, by the way. So there's some feelers out there, but there's nothing right around the corner, and the fighting's going to continue.
Can I just ask you a question about innovation?
Yes.
Your former counterpart, the Ukrainian Chad, famously put, General Milley's counterpart in Ukraine back in November did an interview, and he also, I think, wrote an article about the role of innovation, and that is where Ukraine has an advantage, and it is the way forward in order perhaps to have a happier outcome for Ukraine. Could you comment on that?
Sure. So there is a big role for innovation. There always is in any war. My former counterpart, Zaluzny, who was removed, actually, he's now
He's an ambassador now.
He's the ambassador. He's an ambassador. He's the Ukrainian ambassador to Britain, to UK. Anyway, this war, like most wars, has a lot of traditional things that have happened in the past. So you got threads of continuity, and there are a wide variety of innovative tactics and technologies that are being introduced in this battlefield. One of those is the use of unmanned aerial vehicles. So we are seeing on both sides, Ukrainian and Russian, a very, very high use of unmanned aerial vehicles. That is having a significant tactical effect on the battlefield. In and of itself, it won't make the difference of winning or losing, but it certainly has a major contribution to the war. Another one, for example, is hypersonic weapons. You read about those in the media once in a while. The Chinese have tested them, we test them, but the Russians have used them in Ukraine. They've used hypersonic weapons in Ukraine. They haven't proven to be, a game changer sort of thing. And this is what I always caution to people about when I was on active duty and giving advice to different people. There are no wonder weapons in warfare. Warfare, and technologically, both sides, typically in history and today, most sides kind of have access to the same sorts of technologies, some bigger, some less. It's not just the technological weapon. You got to combine that with the tactics, the organization, the leadership development, and the training. And then you have to do that in time and space relative to your opponent on a given battlefield to achieve tactical and operational success in support of strategic objectives. So if you go back in time in World War II, lots of weapons were developed, and I put nuclear weapons off to the side, but lots of different weapons were developed in World War II or World War I, and none of them in and of themselves were decisive. So there's a lot of innovation going on. The Ukrainians are unbelievable innovators, by the way, and crisis tends to bring that out in people. But the Ukrainians are technological. I don't know if genius is the right word, but they're amazing. They're like MacGyvers, right? And they're doing stuff with weapons and tactics that is very innovative. And yet they're a small power relative to Russia. So you've got a relatively small country with a relatively small military, with less technological prowess than the Russians, and have brought the Russians to a standstill, which is unbelievable. And a lot of that has to do with innovation and technology, but it's in combination with some other things.
Yeah. And if I could just jump in on that. And I think it's, I mean, you touched on this, but it's, this is an existential war for Ukraine. The Ukrainians, at the beginning of the war, there were some Ukrainians who thought we can still work this out with the Russians. And then when the Ukrainians started being able to beat back the Russians in those northern suburbs of Kyiv, and they discovered what had happened. You know, innocent civilians tortured, raped, killed, children abducted and taken to Russian. And the figure now, you know, I think sometimes we think that it's individual cases of kids being taken to Russia, but actually the number right now, according to Russian figures, there was a Russian report that came out last summer, 700,000. 700,000 children that have been taken from their families who, you know, have families that love them. And these kids are not going to know that. They're not going to be speaking Ukrainian. They're going to think that they're Russian. And this is what Russia is planning on doing in Ukraine. They are going to, it's not just about the land, it's also about destroying the Ukrainian people as a people. And you know, so Ukrainians have understood that they can either, you know, fight back, or they will be killed, or they will be Russified. And so those last two options are not an option. And so for me, this goes back to the X factor, where we had so many experts on Russia, so many experts on Ukraine, back when there was the buildup and the beginning of the war saying, Ukraine's going to collapse in 5 days. And it didn't turn out to be true because of the Ukrainian people. Russia took on a nation, and it found that it wasn't able to swallow them whole the way that they had thought. And I think that's really important, and it takes me back to what you're saying. I'm not going to take you on the military analysis, but what I would say is that nothing is inevitable. And I think that as Ukraine seeks to improve its position on the ground for those ultimate negotiations, because I agree with you, this is going to end in a negotiation of some sort. As it continues to do that, I think whether it's the role of innovation, whether it's our continued assistance, whether it's, you know, all of that in combination, as you're saying, but also that X factor of the Ukrainian people, hugely, hugely important. So I will turn it back over to you.
And the problem with negotiations is you can't trust Putin. Mm-hmm. I mean, he's a dictator, he's a killer, and all of that, right? All the bad stuff. And if you negotiate with him, does that embolden him or not? I don't know. I'll let others try to figure that out. Well, so back in the day in Makash 10, I sat up there, way up there, for Dr. Cohen. The Marshal, the ambassador, sat right over there. She got an A, I got a C. So just, and I've always believed in civilian control of the military, so we'll do whatever you guys tell us to do.
So one thing, and of course, he is now a civilian, right?
No.
One thing just to remind, and I know everybody in this room knows this, but just to remind, back in 2014, 2015, with the first round of Russia's war of aggression on Ukraine, the Russians and the Ukrainians did have a negotiation. The Europeans were sort of hosting it, and they were pretty insistent. And so there were two accords that were signed, Minsk Accords, and the Russians never actually implemented any part of it, including a ceasefire. And so for the Ukrainians, when, you know, nobody wants peace more than Ukrainians. They are the ones who are fighting and dying. But when, you know, good-hearted souls tell them, you really need to stop because, you know, this is not good, and let's sit down with the Russians and negotiate in good faith. Well, everybody wants to negotiate in good faith. The Ukrainians remembered what happened in 14-15 and how it was the lead up to 2022. And they don't want to see that movie again.
I agree.
You know, we'll do maybe one more question, then I want to open it up to the floor and get questions from the audience. But you've both spoken about the incredible bravery of the Ukrainian people. And so much of this is about helping them get to a future that is free, sovereign, with their territorial integrity, but also democratic. And that underlies so much of our relationship. And it's not a given. Ambassador Yovanovitch, you spent your whole career fighting corruption in Ukraine and in other former Soviet republics. You know, right now, Ukraine has been under martial law since 2022. President Zelensky's term officially expired May 20th. They've postponed elections. You know, how do we move to, how long can that continue? And when we look at what Ukraine needs to do to make sure that what comes out is a democratic society that respects the rule of law, that can attract foreign investment to rebuild because they have a business environment that foreign investors can come into. How do we get to that future?
Yeah, so that's a really important question, and one that is, asked on, by our appropriators, rightly so, right? Why are we spending this money if, as some have said, Ukraine is the most corrupt country in the world? It actually is not. I nominate Russia for that role. But I think Ukraine, the Ukrainian people, first of all, I guess I would say, in its 30 plus years of independence, because they became independent, it's a long history, long nation, huge culture, but the country of Ukraine in its modern element was started in 1991 when the Soviet Union fell apart. And so over the last 35 plus years, I would say that Ukraine has not had great leadership, because in the beginning it was all, Soviet apparatchiks, right? They had served in the Politburo and they just continued the way they had always continued, and that wasn't great. And then, the issue of corruption raised its ugly head, where just as in Russia, just as in other places in the former Soviet Union and around the world, what former security folks, what the politicians were doing, what factory managers were doing, wasn't necessarily illegal, because they were creating, the rules, the laws, the regulations to build a market economy, to build a democracy, even as it was all happening. I mean, you can't kind of call a time out while parliaments debate and, then come back to it. So it wasn't necessarily illegal, but it was definitely wrong and unfair to the Ukrainian people. It was wholesale theft in many cases, where all of the property of the state went to an elite few. And Ukraine's modern history since about 2001 has been the Ukrainian people fighting back on this. Through, they started developing their civil society, journalists, investigative journalists, started working, non-governmental organizations started looking at things and helping reform-minded politicians put together good laws. It was all, starting, and what you can see through numerous elections in Ukraine, through 2 revolutions, and through, these wars with Russia, because that what Ukraine wants is to be free and to be democratic. That's what the Ukrainian people want. And I, for one, am putting my money on the Ukrainian people, because even if the elites of Ukraine, the political and the economic elites, decide, hey, we actually want to go back to the way it was, people in Ukraine are not on the front lines right now. And it's not only the soldiers who are in the trenches, literally the trenches, like in World War I. It's not only them. It's, the people who are going back and forth in ambulances, driving cars that get imported into Ukraine from the western border all the way to the front lines, and then going back and doing it all over again. I mean, people are fighting for, their family, their future, their freedom. They are not doing this to make the oligarchs rich again. And so, I put my money on them. The last thing I would say is part of the reason, I mean, there are many reasons that Putin started this war of aggression against Ukraine, but one of the reasons is that a free and prosperous and secure Ukraine that is a part of Europe, whether it is a part of NATO or not, but is a part of Europe, is a threat to Russia. to the present day system in Russia, because if Ukraine can do it, the Russian people might get some ideas.
Why she was an A. I mean, what can I say? Cohen gave her A's.
With,
I would look at that on the internal politics of Ukraine. I'm not going to comment on that. I would just bring us back as Americans, right? And an American soldier. And even though I'm retired, by the way, by law, a retired general is always a general, and you're always subject to the you're always subject to the Uniform Code of Military Justice and immediate recall to the president at their discretion. And I've never forgotten that. You see it in the news once in a while. So, but look at, and this is not to parse words, but it is to parse words a little bit. The President of the United States, President Biden, said, free, independent, sovereign, and territory intact. The word he didn't say was democratic. Those words weren't said casually. It's an aspiration of the Ukrainian people, for sure. We want to support that, absolutely, 100%. But that is not why that might be why they're fighting. That's not why we're supporting their fight. We're supporting their fight because of that war of aggression and the rules-based order, and we want to prevent great power war. We want to prevent the world from disintegrating into a dog-eat-dog Hobbesian world. That's why we fought in Korea. Some would argue that's why we fought in Vietnam. A lot of debate about that. That's what Gulf War I was about, and so on and so forth. The United States of America, whether we like it or not, and it can be open to all kinds of debate, has been the enforcer of that order since 1945. And it's President Biden's position that we more or less still are, along with our allies and partners. We underwrite that global order. It's that global order that made this country wealthy. It's that global order that allows Princeton to be Princeton, that allows everybody to have, IRAs and stock markets or whatever. It allows this country to flourish and to be prosperous, for us to be independent. If we allow Putin's attack to go unanswered, if aggression goes unanswered, if aggression is allowed to win, then that emboldens further aggression. And your next step might be Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, Romania, or wherever. So for us, I'd love to see Ukraine democratic. That'd be awesome. But that's really not why we are doing what we're doing, even though it's a nice aspiration. What we're doing is helping them because it's directly related to our own security. That's why we're doing it.
I think we'd like to open up for questions. Okay. Yep. All right, start right up front here, and if you could speak loudly, and I'll repeat if needed. So the question, so everyone can hear, is the view on the U.S. policy of not enabling U.S. weapons being used to strike targets in Russian territory.
So, I mean, look, I was deeply involved in all these conversations. It has everything to do with what I said up front, right? The constraints and restraints, the must-dos and can't-dos, right? So here's what you don't want. There's not a person in this room who is at least sane who wouldn't want this, right? You do not want a war between the United States and Russia, period. You don't want that. You want deterrence. You do not want a war between the United States and China. Look, these are great powers. The United States, China, and Russia have unbelievable capabilities. As weakened as Russia is, as damaged as they are, they still have 4,000 nuclear weapons, and they work. It's not like Iran and it's an aspiration. Their shit works. Okay? So if you're sitting in the sit room and you're the president of the United States and you have all of your lives in your hands, you got to make some pretty sober calculations. And they're pretty hard-nosed and they're not always popular, right? So You don't want that war. So as it turns to weapons, so if we provide, United States provides weapons to Ukraine to strike deep into Mother Russia, who knows what happens? You're at Vegas at that point, and you're rolling the dice, and you're pulling the slot machine. Is that a level of risk that you, Mr. President, are willing to do? Are you willing to provide long-range ATACMS to fire almost close to Moscow? Are you willing to provide F-16s that can strike Moscow? Do you really want to do that? Now, if the Ukrainians strike Moscow, have at it. Airborne. Go for it. You're in the next such a fight. You're in the war of your life. But if you're using U.S. manufactured weapons to do that, then there's an element of risk there. I'm not saying anything's guaranteed. I'm not saying that we would go to war. But there's a calculation there that any president has to make in those sorts of things. And he has been, and the administration has been criticized about being overly cautious, risk averse. Well, that sounds good when you're on TV and you're making commentary. But when you're sitting there and you got the lives of 325 million Americans in your hands, you better think hard, long and hard, about every step you take, because there's no free lunch out there, and the world is a brutal, vicious place. It's not all a bunch of friendly people out there. And who knows, this guy Putin threatened just 2 days ago, to attack Ukraine. He has said 4 different times, on 4 different occasions, that he would consider the use of tactical nuclear weapons. So when Hitler says he's going to kill the Jews, you might believe him. When Saddam says he's going to go into Kuwait, you might want to believe these guys. You know, when Putin says in the summer of 2021 that I'm going to attack Ukraine, and he writes a 17-page article, believe him. Believe declaratory policy. You got to at least take it into consideration. So it has everything to do with these weapons, has everything to do with the potential of a much broader escalatory war. And that becomes a real problem. That's the horns of a dilemma. And when you're dealing with a great power, that's a real challenge. And there's, for the United States, there's one person and one person alone who makes those decisions, and that's the President of the United States. And frankly, even though I'm retired, I fully support the decisions he's made to date. He's trying to hit line drive singles every single day. And I see people on TV beating their chest, former generals, people from both sides of the aisle, who are airborne. I've heard so much who airborne shit. I buried 242 kids, and they're in Arlington. My dad saw a lot of guys killed. War is a really, really serious goddamn thing, and you better make real, slow, calculated choices before you cross that line of departure. And that'd be my advice to any president. So I got it with the weapons going in deep in there, but it's okay. If they want to build the weapons, that's great, and they do, by the way. They build weapons that go deep in. And we just made some recent decisions to give them some additional capabilities, and that's good too. But calculation, very sobering, very, very hard choices, and I'm not one to second guess that guy who has to make those calls.
So I just like to. So I have a slightly different take. I don't disagree with anything that you've said. In terms of, I am so grateful that right now we have a president and a cabinet that are seriously looking at all the issues and are weighing things in a sober-minded way. I think I come out in a slightly different place on this issue of whether the United States should provide Russia with sanctuary in terms of Russian forces, Russian arms being able to come right up to the international border with Ukraine, and they have the ability to throw stuff at Ukraine, and they can do it from a huge standoff as well. I mean, now they're sending planes up with what they call these glide bombs. Is that right? The glide bombs, where these glide bombs can go for 1,000 kilometers into Ukraine, and you hear Ukrainian soldiers who are like, I've got the plane in my sights and I can't do anything. And so I would just say that I think we need to be thinking about that decision again as to whether we want to be providing sanctuary to Russia to attack Ukraine in that manner. I think there are risks, no question about it, but there also are risks in not doing enough. And I wasn't on the Ukraine file in 2014, 2015, but I think many people would agree, as you said earlier, that we didn't do enough to deter Russia. We did some things, but the price was not high enough. And Russia thought in leading up to 22, I've got this big war chest, I've got my military all ready to go, the West is weak, Joe Biden, can't get it together, NATO, according to the French, not in any shape. I can take this country, I can do this. And I think that we want to avoid a situation where Putin feels empowered to keep on going. We need to, I'm one of those people who has said that the administration has been a little too deferential to Putin and his red lines. We don't know what those red lines are. And red lines that have been announced, we've blown through them. I mean, you mentioned the one about Finland and Sweden joining NATO. That was one of the reasons why nuclear war was going to be, I think actually Putin said he was going to attack them. That never happened. It was like, ho hum, they joined NATO. So I think that Putin is a bully. We know that about him. And bullies back down when they are confronted. There are risks in that. And so getting that calibration right, that is, as you said, it's a job of the cabinet, it's the job of the President of the United States who makes the final decision. But I would say that I think sometimes we have acted a little too cautiously, and it has allowed more running room for Putin and the Russians. The last thing I would say on this, I think you know that Secretary Blinken was just in Ukraine, and from, again, reading between the lines in the newspapers, as you mentioned, it certainly looks like we are looking at that policy again. And, I think what we all know is that, there are conversations behind closed doors, and they kind of leak into the press to see, the trial balloon, how are people reacting. And you can certainly see other countries, the UK, which has often led the way in terms of, being out front and then we follow. The UK is already there on this issue. I mean, my guess is that we're going to be there at some point. I don't know what. And that is the other thing I would say, that we need to accelerate our decision-making process. Consensus is important. Getting all the pros and cons out there are important. But this is a crucial war, as Mark has laid out. It is crucial for Ukraine, it's existential, but it is also crucial for us, because if Russia wins, Russia will keep on going.
I'll go to the woman in the white sitting on the floor.
Yeah.
I'll repeat for the crowd. So Lithuania and other eastern flank states, I'll say it's the same in Romania, are incredibly appreciative of the US presence. What sort of signal might it send if that policy changes under a different administration?
I mean, I hesitate to predict the next election, and shit, I might become a Lithuanian depending on the outcome, right? So, so look at, immediately upon the Russian invasion, President Biden ordered us to deploy immediately US military forces in every single country that bordered Russia. So Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, we already had guys, some guys in Poland. We increased that significantly, put them in Romania, and we really plussed the numbers up a lot, ground troops. And then we also increased the number of air squadrons, fourth and fifth generation fighter bombers, and we significantly increased the number of naval capabilities in NATO. And then there was a variety of public declaratory policy remarks by President Biden and other senior officials that said that any NATO Article 5 country, we, the United States, will defend. And he said to the Russians, and he was unambiguous, said it publicly, if you invade or cross into any NATO Article 5 country, you'll be dealing with the United States at that point. And that's what NATO's all about. And a reminder, Ukraine is not NATO Article 5, right? Aspiring to be, yes. Aspiring to be in EU, aspiring to be NATO. But at that point, they were not. But we rapidly deployed those forces as a deterrent measure. Did it work? I don't know. You can never prove a negative. So did that impact Putin's calculations? I don't know. The introduction of Sweden and Finland into NATO. NATO is arguably way stronger today than it was at the beginning of this war. NATO percentage of GDP money that each of the NATO countries is putting against defense is much higher today than it was, say, a few years ago. So NATO, arguably, from a military standpoint, is much stronger today. What would happen in the next election, you're asking? I don't know in terms of actual fact, and it would be presumptuous of me to speculate what a President Biden would do or what a President Trump would do or whomever is the president, right? One of the things I've learned as a member of the Joint Chiefs of Staff and as the chairman for Obama, I was on the Joint Chiefs, for Trump on the Joint Chiefs, the Chief of Staff of the Army, and then as chairman, and then Biden as his chairman, right? One of the things I've learned about presidential decision-making, it's very situational. It's not necessarily predictable, far in advance, months ahead, like what you're talking about. It's very situational, and it's very in the moment. So we do a massive amount of planning. The State Department does planning. The CIA does planning. We do contingency planning. We have war games. They're very sophisticated with computers and all sorts of things. But at the end of the day, presidential decision-making is a very human thing. And character matters, and your instincts matter, and the person in that seat matters immensely. And I don't know with certainty, and I certainly couldn't tell you with any sort of degree of certainty what would happen no matter who's the president, right? My instinct, not certainty by any means, my instinct says that you will continue to have forward deployed forces backing up NATO Article 5 countries under a President Biden administration. And you would have continued support, or at least presidential support for Ukraine. And then you'll see some things, my guess is you'll see some things in the diplomatic world with Blinken or maybe Director Burns from the CIA, or do some things to set conditions. Ultimately, a negotiation is not us. Negotiations between the Ukrainian people and Zelensky and the Russian people and Putin. It's between those people. The best thing we could ever do, the only thing we could ever do, is set up some kind of framework. But if you saw our President Biden, that's my guess, assuming continued support with Congress, that would be the direction of travel. If you get a President Trump in office, I think things would get pretty sporty. I think things would get, there'd be some really significant dynamic change. He has said that. So just read declaratory policy again. Read what President Trump has said with respect to the Russians and NATO, with respect to NATO, and with respect to Ukraine. And I think you'll find your answers in what they say, which each respective guy says.
Sir with the hat.
have to wrap it up. We have to wrap it up.
So I think I think we'll try to wrap it up with this, but could there have been a different outcome when we came up to February 24, 2022, as Russian forces massed, and could there have been a different outcome with a different NATO trajectory prior to this period of time?
Well, I'll take the questions, but I mean, you were actually in the government at that time. I had already retired. So you know, looking at it from the outside, which is where I was at that point in December of 21. So as you pointed out, the Russians gave the US and gave NATO these long letters with all these demands about this is what we need in order not to invade. I mean, I think they prettied up the language, but that was the bottom line. And so we actually had a series of meetings with them over December and January, maybe even into February. And our responses, I thought, again, you know, I mean, these were publicly available or became publicly available, were pretty serious because, you know, some of the demands, requests, whatever you wanted, you know, had been on the table for a while. And, you know, it's my view, we didn't take it seriously enough over the past X number of years. And so we didn't accept all of it. We didn't accept a lot of it. But, you know, there were a number of issues where we said, we can talk about this and let's start. And it just became clear that that was just a time-wasting exercise to make it look as though Russia was interested in something that it really wasn't. The Russians often do that. That's a well-known Russian tactic. And I think they were just wasting our time as they were getting ready to invade, and nothing was going to dissuade them from that. I think that, you know, what you guys did in terms of releasing the intel back in late November, early December of 21, that, you know, the Russians were massing and this is their intent. I've never seen anything like that in my entire career. And so that, I think, put the Russians off their game. So they needed to use the time anyway. But I don't think they were ever serious. But I'd be interested from the inside what you thought.
Well, on the question of the NATO piece and then the question of the invasion itself. So, first of all, you can't change history, right? So you can't go back and change it. What you're asking about is lessons learned. I think it's worth studying. I mean, if from the Russian perspective, I don't agree with this, by the way, but their argument, if you think about it, and again, Marcia knows Russia way better than I do. She speaks Russian. She got an A in the course. But from the Russian perspective, Russia's a very insecure society because they have land that is invadable, right? And they have a history of it. I mean, Genghis Khan went in there and stacked skulls for 300 years and occupied Rus, the ancient capital, right? And I mean, that was a pretty brutal experience. 300 years of living under Genghis Khan, that kind of sinks into your DNA. And then Napoleon, you know, he got a hell of a time getting out, but he got in okay. And he torched Moscow. So that's kind of a big story in Russian history. I mean, you know, guy wrote a huge book about it, right? War and Peace and all that. So, and then of course the Nazis. I mean, the Nazis are living memory. So I grow up in a house and I hear about Iwo Jima. My mother's brother fights in the Philippines. I hear about the Philippines. I hear about my uncle at Omaha. All the neighborhood, everybody in the neighborhood were World War II veterans. And you heard that growing up. And of course, Vietnam's going on. It's very controversial. So at the kitchen table for Vlad Putin are stories of Leningrad. It's living memory. His mother and father are survivors of Leningrad. They're eating horses, and there's cannibalism. They're drinking their own urine for water. It was 900-day siege. It was brutal. There is not a family in Russia that wasn't touched by World War II and the brutality of World War II. And when they saw, the Russians saw, the NATO inter-German boundary come down in 89, 90, 91, we saw it as a big, you know, victory. We're doing a happy dance in the end zone, high-fiving. We won the Cold War, you know, hoo-hoo, boom, right? That's not what they saw. They saw the Nazi frontline trace. Right now, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, Poland, Romania, etc. You draw a line and you look at 1942 and look at where the Wehrmacht was. That's about their frontline trace. So what they saw, what the Russian people saw, was the collapse of their security system, which was the historical security system of all the czars. For 300 years, they established a buffer zone from the west, because it's just one big flat plain with a couple of rivers, right? Easily invaded from the west. That's what they saw. And then their pride went right into the dumpster, right? And we rubbed their nose in it too. You know, bad Russia, America good, boom, yeah, we won, you lost. And we were really good at doing that. So all the 90s, their pride goes way, way down, right? And then they lost money, they bled money out the yin-yang, and they were on their back financially. So Thucydides tells us that wars, and this is 2,000 years ago, and no one's ever improved on what he said, but wars have been caused by pride, fear, and interest. And that's exactly what's at play. So fear from the Russians of the Western, the NATO, and all that kind of stuff. Pride, you know, in the doldrums, I was a Russian Empire, the Tsars, the Soviet Union, I was a great power, nuclear power, and then interest, lost all that money. So from the Russian perspective, they saw that as a terrible act of aggression, that NATO boundary. That's not what I saw, and that's not what I believe even today, but that's what they saw. And that goes, and Putin exemplifies that. He comes from a family where he exemplifies it, and he grew up in the KGB and all the rest of it, and he believes it. I mean, he's a brutal, killer and all that, but he actually believes that narrative deep in his soul. So he rips his shirt off, grabs a hockey stick, gets on a white horse, and say, "My beloved Russian people, I love you, I will protect you. Follow me, and I will show you the light and the way to Damascus." And everybody says, "Yeah, roger that, and he gets 80% popularity, and all of a sudden he has a dictatorship. So the NATO thing, there's a lot of lessons learned. One of it, one of the great lessons learned of NATO is Appomattox, right? Be generous when you win. Don't rub your enemy's nose in it, because then you're going to create that backlash, that lost cause narrative of the Civil War, the lost cause narrative of World War I, that kind of thing. And that's kind of what happened. As far as going into the actual invasion of 22, look, I was there. Nations go to war, right? This is my theory anyway, for what it's worth. Nations go to war over core, C-O-R-E, core, vital national security interests. Okay, remember that. So if the Japanese attack Pearl Harbor, we're going to war. If bin Laden and his guys strike the Twin Towers, we're going to war. But if you lose, 16 or 18 Rangers in Mogadishu, because you're trying to feed the hungry, we're pulling out. If you lose 242 Marines in Beirut, trying to keep the peace between people and draw green lines and red lines and purple lines, whatever there were, we're pulling out. So wars are fought and cost is incurred directly proportionate to the objective you are trying to achieve. And that has to be, for war, a core vital national security interest. Ukraine or Russia is a core vital national security interest. We may not agree with that argument. We may not like it, but it is in their mind. In their mind, that's a core vital national security interest. Ukraine is not NATO Article 5. Therefore, it is not a core, C-O-R-E, vital. It's a vital national security interest. It's not a core vital national security interest. If it was, we would have had troops already engaged in armed combat against Russia. It was enough for us to give them weapons, money, support, and to deploy troops all around Russia to prevent a greater war. So we did, in my view, and I get all the critics that are out there, and a lot of them are from Congress and so on, that the Biden administration did not do enough to deter war. I want to know what exactly they would have done to prevent that. Because I believe that administration did everything humanly possible, as fast as they could, to signal the Russians, do not do this, and here's what's going to happen if you do. These sanctions, this, that, and the other thing, and all the actions that were taken. But the one action we didn't take was deploy troops to engage in armed combat against Russian forces. And why is that? Ukraine is not NATO Article 5. It's not a core vital national security interest. It's an interest, vital, but not core. It's really important, but we're not quite there to the point of armed combat between Russia and the United States. So deterrence, when you're facing a situation where one side's got a core vital national security interest, the other side doesn't, you can do everything you can do, but if they're determined to do it, they're probably going to do it. I'm still a C student. I worked hard, though. I plugged hard.
Ambassador,
Yeah.
you want to?
No, I think I'll leave it at that since I think we're trying to close.
So any final words before we wrap up? Or I think we're all set.
I am going to say one thing before we wrap up. So you met Dora earlier when she introduced us, and she runs this great organization called ROSM. And if you are wondering what to do with your money, if you have been at all touched by some of the things that we are saying, please consider contributing to ROSM. They do wonderful work in Ukraine and have been on the ground since 2014. They have a grassroots network and are saving lives every day.
And we have just a few announcements from Lydia Zanager.
Yeah, I know it's hot. I'm so sorry. Stick with me for just one quick moment, if you would. My name is Lydia Zeininger. I'm a member of the great class of '83. Glad to say the ambassador is also honorary '83, which we forgot to put in our materials. A bit of shameless self-promotion here. I am the director of a wonderful organization called the Ukrainian Institute of America in New York. We're housed in a National Historic Landmark building on 5th Avenue and 79th Street. For 75 years, we've been showcasing and preserving Ukrainian heritage and culture. Please come visit us. A few words of thanks, if I may. If you indulge me here in this public forum, I need to recognize a person who is the heart and soul and engine of our Ukrainian community here at Princeton. She's an idea generator, an efficient organizer, wise counselor, sincere and trusted friend. Thank you, Areta Paulinsky, for all you do. Without Areta, today's event would not have happened. Thank you, Madam Ambassador. You took the wind out of some of my sail here. I want to thank Dora running ROSM. It's an amazing organization. Thank you, Lauren, for coming from Romania for today's event. Thank you, Madam Ambassador. General Milley, your support is incredible. It gives Ukrainians confidence to keep the fight going. Thank you.
Hey, one final word. As you guys go out and party all weekend, which I encourage everybody to do, drive safely, don't drink too much and all that. But remember one thing, it's Memorial Day weekend, and give a little bit of thought to those soldiers, sailors, airmen, Marines who have given you your freedom. Thank you.